Welcome back to the De Nicola Winter Conference. We belong to each other. My name is Patrick Deneen. I am a professor of political science here at the University of Notre Dame. And while it is lamentable that we are not in our accustomed gathering, enjoying each other's company, including the midnight meatballs at Carter's house and unforgettable hospitality after these sessions, in some ways, we're making the best of this occasion, bringing together for this session two people who might otherwise be difficult to get together here in South Bend on the drop of a hat. This panel is entitled "The Ties That Bind: Recovering Our Social Institutions," and I'll ask each of the participants to offer some opening comments, about 15 minutes each, and then we'll have a conversation largely between the two of them with occasional interjections from your host. Those of you who wish to ask questions during the conversation, just click on the Q&A icon on the bottom of your Zoom screen, really at any time, and submit a question to the moderator, and we'll try to get through as many of those as we can in the last 15 to 20 minutes of our session. We'll wind up promptly at 5:15. Well, I'm delighted to introduce two friends, former neighbors of mine, in a sense, back in my days in D.C., and two really, I think, superlative thinkers on the state of our social institutions, justly renowned public intellectuals. We'll hear first from Yuval Levin, who is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He's the founder and current editor of the indispensable journal National Affairs, a senior editor at the New Atlantis, another indispensable journal, and a contributing editor to the National Review. Yuval served as a member of the White House Domestic Policy staff under George W. Bush and was executive director of the President's Council on Bioethics. His essays and articles have appeared in numerous publications such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. He's authored several books, most recently A Time to Build: From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, How Recommitting to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. And since I'm the moderator, I'll also shout out his earliest book, The Great Debate, a really sterling study of the thought of Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine, which benefited immensely from an extraordinary outside dissertation advisor in its earliest form. But many of my students are familiar with the book. I assign it regularly in classes that I teach. Ross Douthat is an op-ed columnist for the New York Times, a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and author of multiple books, including his most recent, The Decadent Society, as well as To Change the Church, Bad Religion, and The Grand New Party. Ross was previously a senior editor for the New Atlantic and is currently a film critic for the National Review and co-host of the Argument podcast at the New York Times. He lives with his wife and 4 children in my home state of Connecticut in New Haven. So with that, let me ask Yuval to offer some opening comments and observations about our theme. We belong to each other, the ties that bind, recovering our social institutions. Thanks, Yuval.
Thanks very much, Patrick. I appreciate that. That book, as you may have gathered from what Patrick said, began as my dissertation, and Patrick was on the dissertation committee, and he never missed a chance to advise me to be harder on my subjects. I was going too easily on them for his taste at all times, and that did help a lot. Thank you. I'm very grateful to the center for gathering us like this. It's always wonderful to be there in person, and as Patrick says, particularly to be at the Sneed's house for the extraordinary days-long gargantuan meals that they put together for the entire massive community. But it's also a pleasure just to be part of the intellectual community that Carter and the rest of you have built there. It's an extraordinary achievement. And I really am grateful for the chance to be with Patrick and with Ross, both of whom are friends and both of whom are people I admire enormously and learn from constantly. Ross really is, I think, the person who understands this moment in America better than anybody else I've encountered. And I never fail to learn from him, his writing and his work. Our subject, in a sense, invites us to think broadly about the condition of American social life, and I'll try to do that a little bit. It's worth noting that we're doing it in a moment when some of the dysfunctions and breakdowns of American social life have made themselves very apparent in our politics. What we've seen lately has to be understood as a breakdown, and one that will be very, very difficult to recover from and rebuild from. And I want to think a little bit here briefly, so as to make room for conversation, about how that breakdown might be rooted in things that are really beyond politics or before politics. In a sense, Americans have pretty clearly been living through a social crisis, certainly in this century, in some ways before, of course. We can see that now in everything from the vicious partisan polarization of our politics, to a rampant culture war full of resentments, to the isolation, alienation, and really despair that sent people in their private lives into a sense of alienation and disjunction, that has sent suicide rates climbing, that's driven an epidemic of opioid abuse in parts of our society. All of these different dysfunctions seem like they must have some common roots, but those roots are not always obvious. And when we think about our problems, I think we tend to a kind of individualism, even when we think about the social. We tend to imagine our society as this vast open space that's filled with individuals who are having trouble connecting. And so we talk about breaking down walls and building bridges and leveling playing fields. And those are important, and that is part of the problem we confront. But I think what we miss when we talk that way is not just that we lack connectedness in this moment, but that we lack something like a structure for our social life, a way to really give shape and purpose and concrete meaning to the things that we do together. And if American life is a big open space, it's not a space that's just filled with individuals. It's a space filled with these structures of social life. It's a space filled with institutions. And if too often we're failing now to foster belonging and legitimacy and trust, then we're really living through a failure of institutions. The social crisis that takes this form has been understood, I think, broadly as involving a loss of trust in institutions. And often when we think about institutions now in the social sciences or in public commentary, it's that question of trust that comes up. And we know it's almost a cliche that Americans have been losing trust in institutions. But I think we haven't really given enough thought to what that actually means and why it might be happening. Every one of our core institutions serves some essential task in society. Maybe it's educating children, maybe it's enforcing the law, maybe it's serving the poor, providing some service, meeting some kind of need. And it does that by establishing a structure and a process, a form for combining people's efforts toward accomplishing that common end. And as it does it, each institution also forms the people within it to carry out that task in a responsible, reliable way. It creates an ethic, and so it does ethical work. It shapes people's behavior and character, and it builds an ethic that's constructed around some idea of integrity. That's why we trust institutions. That's what it means to trust an institution, is not only to believe that it's competent and capable of doing the work that we ask of it, but also to believe that it makes the people within it worthy of trust. So that if we were to trust a political institution, we would have to think that there's some idea of the public interest at the center of it that the people in it really take seriously. We trust a profession because it seems to impose some kind of standards and rules on its members that can make them worthy of trust. We trust the military. It's one of the few institutions we do trust because it seems to form men and women who take duty and honor seriously. And it's not just that it does its job well, but that it understands that kind of formation to be part of its job. And we lose faith in an institution when we can't really believe any longer that it plays that kind of ethical, formative role. Sometimes that happens through corruption, when an institution maybe tries to be formative, but isn't able to overcome the vices and sins of the people within it, and instead ends up masking those. That's a kind of gross abuse of power that obviously undermines public trust in institutions. It's common in our time, unfortunately, but it's common in every time. And I don't think it quite explains the distinct loss of confidence that we've seen in our society lately. What does stand out to me about our time in particular is a different, distinct kind of institutional dereliction, which is a failure even to try to form trustworthy people, and a tendency instead to think of our institutions not as in the business of molding character and behavior, but instead as in the business of elevating or displaying the people in them, not as molds, but as platforms, not as formative, but as performative. And in one arena after another in American life now, we find people who should be insiders formed by institutions, acting like outsiders performing on institutions. A lot of members of Congress clearly treat their jobs that way. They just see the institution as a place to stand and be seen and build a bigger following and get a better time slot on cable news. Clearly, President Trump has seen the presidency that way for the last 4 years, as a place to perform, a particularly high stage. But that pattern is rampant well beyond politics. You see it in the professional world, you see it in the media, you see it in the academy. All of these institutions become just places to stand and yell about the culture war. And whether you're talking about a major newspaper, and I won't name one for Ross's sake, or we're talking about a major university, they all come to be seen as just a place to stand and yell about oppression. And the differences between them begin to wither away. Their distinct purposes, their distinct integrities begin to wither away. And they just become stages for a kind of performance art that now passes for the political. That happens in a lot of different arenas now in American life. And it's come to define or to drive a kind of loss of public confidence, because it's very hard to trust an institution that just functions as a platform, that doesn't do much more than display the people in it. It doesn't restrain them. It doesn't enable them to exercise any kind of authority or expertise in a respectable way. And the few exceptions to the pattern of declining confidence in institutions, I think, tend to prove that rule. You see it, as I said before, in the military, which it clearly sees itself as formative. You see it in some local and interpersonal institutions, in some religious institutions that clearly do take their formative purpose seriously, and for that reason are taken seriously by the people around them. And that suggests that a recovery from this, a rebuilding of institutional confidence, of trust in institutions, has to begin by people within those taking their responsibilities seriously. The problem we face is not that the public doesn't trust institutions, it's that they're not trustworthy. And the question is how to make them trustworthy. And the answer to that has to work from the inside out, or from the bottom up, from the people in them. All of us have roles to play in some set of institutions that we care about, from our family and community and religious and educational institutions to our professional and civic and political and cultural institutions. Rebuilding trust in them is going to require people within them, that is, each of us in some way, to be more trustworthy. And that has to mean, in part, letting those distinct integrities and purposes of these institutions shape us somehow, rather than just using them to elevate ourselves. As a practical matter, I think that means forcing ourselves in crucial moments of decision, large and small, to ask that great unasked question of American life right now, which is, given my role here, how should I behave? Given the responsibilities that come with whatever position I have here, what decision should I make? That kind of question is essential to responsibility, and it's ultimately essential to rebuilding trust. Asking it, I think, is a first step toward grasping our obligations to one another, the ways in which we do belong to one another. And I think that it's ultimately an essential prerequisite to what we might think of more traditionally as institutional reform, as ways of fixing institutions. You can't really reform until the people within our institutions understand themselves, ourselves, as part of the problem, and therefore as a necessary part of the solution. And I don't think we get to a place where we can think about belonging in the larger sense, in the social, national sense, before we can address these problems at the interpersonal level, where we are, where we begin, where we really have obligations to one another that are personal and interpersonal. And it's by starting there that we can have some hope. If you look at America from the top down right now, I don't see a lot of reasons for hope. But if you look at America from the bottom up, I think there are plenty, and there are opportunities to build out more. So maybe that's what I'd say to start, but I'm eager for the conversation.
Thank you so much, Yuval. Why don't we turn now to Ross and hear his reflections. Thanks.
So thank you, Patrick and Yuval. It's great to be with you both, and to be, to the extent that we can be together in this moment, to be together for this conversation. I will say that I am very much looking forward to discussions in the flesh in a post-pandemic world. I never really imagined that I would miss, overnight airline flights to distant colleges to give talks, but and be on panels. But I actually find myself really missing them these days, as everybody is missing certain things. So here's to the future, but it's good to be together in this form now. And Yuval, that's, incredibly kind of you to say that you think that I have some kind of handle on what's happening in the United States and the Western world right now, because in general, but maybe especially in the last month or so, I guess I feel less and less sure that I know exactly what's happening. And my remarks will probably be a little more scattered for that reason. My basic theory of the situation in the United States in the early 21st century is the one that I put forward in my last book, which came out at the same time as Yuval's fine book. And, at the time I thought you could sort of put them together. Mine was more diagnostic and Yuval's was offering maybe more of a hopeful prescription. But my argument was basically that the defining reality for the last 20 years, maybe for the last 40 or 50, has been a kind of disappointing stagnation, a sort of intellectual and political torpor, gridlock and sort of ineffectiveness in institutions, as sort of Yuval gestured at and described, combined with a scale of wealth and comfort and entertainment and so on that prevented any of this discontent and stagnation from leading to actual crisis and collapse. And so this is sort of a pessimistic account in certain ways, but also an optimistic account in the sense that it suggested that the kind of stability that we have, while enervating and depressing in various ways, also does offer opportunities for creativity and innovation within, sort of under conditions of decadence that can hopefully lead out of decadence without having to have an intervening collapse, dark age, and so on. And again, that's where I think, the sort of combination with Yuval's vision of renewal and reform in our institutions was maybe a useful one for readers. Obviously, over the last year, we have been faced with a unique challenge, a sort of a crisis imposed from outside that has led to crises that are internal to our society, that sort of take the weaknesses of the pre-existing, if you will, decadent landscape and turn them into potential disasters, I think is a fair way to put it. And you can see this dynamic at work on both ends of the political spectrum. We saw it at work on the rightward end of the political spectrum just in the last week or so. We saw it at work on the leftward end of the political spectrum in the excesses associated with protest politics and sort of derangement within liberal institutions over the summer. And it's what I'm deeply uncertain about is how much of this turn from decadence to crisis is just a function of the unique conditions of the pandemic, both the disease itself and the turn inward towards the virtual worlds that have, on the one hand, helped stabilize our economy, but have also, I think, had a really profoundly disastrous psychological effect on people as they've sort of left the physical behind more and more completely. And, one of my theories before this year was that virtual reality was fundamentally a stabilizing force in Western life, not in necessarily a good way, often in sort of a Brave New World, go to the feelies kind of way, but fundamentally sort of a substitute for real world political strife and violence and all kinds of things. And, I think you have to revise that assessment somewhat and say that maybe that's true under normal conditions, but under conditions where people are sort of pushed fully out of the real and into the virtual, the effect can be sort of less stabilizing and more deeply deranging. And it can then sort of push people back into reality, carrying the flag of QAnon or the flag of Antifa in ways that wouldn't have happened absent the pandemic. So that's one sort of possibility that I am uncertainly wrestling with, I guess. And again, the question is how much of this is temporary, and to what extent will stability and decadence return post-pandemic, and to what extent is this a case where a crisis has exposed, these fundamental weaknesses, and even when the crisis is gone, or even when the pandemic is gone, the derangement will remain. And obviously, I guess we will find out in the first 4 years of a Biden presidency. But I think, to sort of separate from the particular challenge of the COVID-19 era, I think something that has been accentuated in the last year, but was visible before that already, is the extent to which the social crisis that Yuval has described, which has been really a fact of American life going back to the social revolutions of the 1960s. It's sort of a deep legacy of those transformations. But prior to the last 10 years or so, I think most reasonable analysis would say that it was primarily a kind of working class, lower middle class, and underclass phenomenon. So if you trace, the rise of out of wedlock births, if you trace a host of other indicators, if you even trace indicators of, declining communal ties, declining social capital, church going, and so on, you would say, okay, America has increasingly a sort of functional upper middle class that exists in sort of more liberal and more conservative forms, exists in both red states and in blue states. And then it has a more and more dysfunctional lower middle and working class, and obviously a dysfunctional underclass as well. And I think you'd have to say right now that the sort of distinction between a relatively functional upper middle class and sort of social crisis elsewhere no longer really holds. And the social crisis has spilled over into both the sort of red America, conservative America, upper middle class, and the sort of meritocratic blue state, Ivy League aspiring class. And again, I'm not completely confident how and why exactly that's happening. Since I live sort of inside the meritocracy, as Patrick mentioned, I live in New Haven, near Yale, sort of in that bubble, I feel like I have a slightly better handle on what's happening in the liberal upper middle class. I think there you're having sort of a breakdown in confidence in meritocracy, which has been sort of the organizing system of that class going back to the 1960s, a system that has delivered that class to a particular kind of power and influence, but has run into several challenges over the last 15 years or so. One challenge being economic transformations that have exposed people in the meritocracy to more and more sort of challenges from, a version of what Peter Turchin of the University of Connecticut, speaking of Connecticut, calls the overproduction of elites, where both within the US and adding sort of competition from abroad, you have too many people chasing too few positions of influence and power. And so you have this sort of surplus class of stressed out would-be professionals that didn't exist to the same extent 20 years ago, that has, in spite of their privileges, has deep economic anxieties, if you will. And then you also have a kind of metaphysical crisis where the arid secularism, the arid secular ambition of meritocracy is under a lot of strain. And the sense that there's a spiritual vacuum within the meritocracy is more powerful than it was when I was, for instance, in college 20 years ago. And into that void has come what we think of as sort of the new progressivism, which sort of has elements of political radicalism, elements of a kind of post-Protestant religiosity. It's sort of inchoate and wrought with internal fissures and tensions. It's not clear to me that it is quite the sort of all-conquering ideology that some of my friends on the right fear that it is, but it's certainly a very powerful force and a novel force that interacts with these economic anxieties, that interacts with, increasing mental strain and mental illness, which is, I think, a powerful feature of elite college life that, again, was not so much the case a generation ago. But all of this is to say there's the breakdown of community in the US has extended itself even unto Yale, Harvard, and Princeton. And you can no longer say that there is sort of a successful meritocracy and, a sort of breakdown elsewhere in society. And then something similar is happening, I think, for the in more conservative America, and I'm less confident about what's going on there. I mean, I think, I can speak maybe particularly to sort of the Catholic element in it, because the Catholic Church in the John Paul II era seemed to be a kind of, reasonably solid bulwark of community and meaning and connection for an important segment of the sort of conservative leaning middle to upper middle class. And that church has undergone, first wave upon wave of sort of sex abuse crisis that speaks to Yuval's points about, the failure of institutions, and then a sort of reignition of the post-Vatican II theological conflicts in the pontificate of Pope Francis. And you just see a sort of, among people whose self-identification as conservatives should make them deeply identified with their religious institution, a profound loss of confidence in that institution that then in turn spills over into, in many cases, sort of, internet-driven paranoia and sort of forms of toxic community, I think, that are more powerful than they were before. But something similar is happening, I think, in evangelicalism. I think there's, a sense of sort of religious defeat among a lot of religious conservatives in the US that's feeding a sense of institutional despair. But and then all of this interacts in some mysterious way with the internet, which of course was not an important force in the first wave of social crisis in the US, but has become an important force in this wave. But the ultimate effect, I think, I'm sorry to be pessimistic. I'll try and come up with sort of optimistic things to say as we go back and forth. But the effect is a substantial weakening in precisely the areas that when we talked about the social crisis 20 years ago, we would have said were the places to sort of start the rebuilding, right? So like, when my colleague David Brooks wrote his book, Bobos in Paradise, in the late 1990s, and he was sort of describing the post-1960s meritocracy, and it was sort of a fond critique, right? And he said, there are various problems with this social class, but they have sort of restabilized their part of America after the chaos of the 1970s, and perhaps from that restabilization, they can become the upper class that America needs. And I don't think anybody thinks that about. I don't think David thinks that. I don't think that about the meritocracy anymore. But then you would say the same thing about a lot of what a lot of conservatives thought about sort of evangelical and Catholic communities in the late 1990s and early 2000s. There was this sense that these communities had sort of passed through the fires of the 1960s and had sort of, rebuilt a foundation for religious revival in the US. And instead, the religious revival we're getting is a wild mix of, Christian nationalism, QAnon, and neo-paganism, and plus the religious side of sort of social justice ideology, none of which seems right now conducive to the kind of reinstitutionalization of American life that Yuval and I both hope for. So anyway, before I get too pessimistic, I think I should break off and we can discuss. But that seems to be the change that's been laid bare in the Trump era, has been the extent to which the social crisis is now in what seemed 15 or 20 years ago to be the more stable portion, the more stable places in American life back then.
So the deep division between Yuval and Ross has manifested itself. I expected Yuval to be pessimistically optimistic about the future, and I expected Ross to be optimistically pessimistic about the future, although I think both of you are actually more pessimistic than that.
It's been a tough few weeks,
and few weeks.
And few weeks.
I'm really struck by, and a few of the people who have posed questions already are also struck by a formulation that Yuval made, an observation, which is one of the deepest crises of our social institutions emanates from a kind of changed way in which people within those institutions understand their role within those institutions. I think increasingly, for instance, just being a college professor today, and I'm sure it's very similar for columnists in the New York Times, et cetera, that you have to be sort of your own promoter. You're encouraged in a lot of ways. What's your social media presence? What's your how many followers do you have? So that our roles within these institutions now increasingly are valued to the extent that we show ourselves to be, in some ways, whatever form that performative aspect might take, whether as an entertainer, or as a bomb thrower, or with the tweets that garner thousands of heart symbols and so forth. And I think it's a reflection of something that I think both Ross and Yuval and myself have been hitting on. I actually see Alexis de Tocqueville in the background next to Yuval there. Two translations.
Keeping me honest.
Less. He deserves at least 2 volumes of different translations. But that Tocqueville, among other things, in many ways feared and predicted that the very thing that makes liberal democracy dynamic, and the thing that we might think about it as successful, prosperous and wealthy and liberating, is going to undermine those institutions. And so even those institutions, which he hoped would give some kind of stability, as you put it, Yuval, would lend a kind of formative aspect to kind of giving a sense of limits, giving a sense of responsibility, a sense of rootedness in a time and in a place when there would be a tendency to be uprooted. To the extent that these institutions now have been in some ways taken over by this same logic of individuation. You suggest that what we're going to need is for individuals within those institutions in some ways to act less performatively, to be more responsible, to begin to see their responsibilities to those forms and to those roles in those institutions. But outside of sort of, to be maybe even more pessimistic than you both, outside of sort of complete and utter social breakdown, what is going to change this dynamic that we see ourselves in right now? And I know, Yuval, your last book and the book even before that, Fractured Republic, talks a lot about the need to revive and how we might begin thinking about reviving some of the vitality of these institutions. And I wonder if maybe before we get too pessimistic, we might think about ways that we might see a way forward to revitalizing or generating anew a kind of a form of institutional role and responsibility that seems to be so much under duress today. Yuval, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot there. I think, I guess I would start by drawing a distinction that might be useful for us here between optimism and hope. A distinction that I at least get from Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the recently deceased former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, who talks about it in terms of a distinction between passivity and activity. To be optimistic is to think things are going to be fine. I don't think that. That's not my view. To be hopeful is to think that there are opportunities for us to help make things better. And I do think that. And one of the things that really stands out to me about this moment is an absence of that kind of hopefulness, which presents itself as a failure to see the problems as opportunities. It seems to me, for example, that we're living in a moment when a lot of our youth culture is just plainly hungry for religion. It just couldn't be more obvious that people are looking for some idea of justice that they can take seriously. And the sorts of institutions that might offer them that are instead looking at them as dangerous enemies, as misguided radicals, as people to be feared and pushed to the side. And it seems to me that that's just a failure to seize an opportunity to advance exactly the kind of social change that might be the only thing that can achieve the enormous transformation that we're talking about here. So that is to say, I think there is often good news in the bad news. The fact of people's dissatisfaction manifests itself sometimes as an openness to transformation, to change. That's how change happens. It doesn't happen when people feel great and want to be better. It happens when people think something is broken down and they want to find a different way. I think there are a lot of people in our society now who think something has been broken down. There are very, very few voices offering them a better way. And in one sense, Irving Kristol said in the early 70s that it's easy for Jews to tell Christians to be better Christians. And so I'm going to try not to do that. But I think there really are opportunities to speak to this society about what traditional religious institutions might offer that looks like a path to a more respectable idea of justice, a truer idea of justice that is more truly fulfilling than what they're getting, the kind of drivel that they get in the elite universities now. But let's not fail to notice that drivel is about justice. It is speaking to a desire for justice. And I think it's a mistake to treat it as less than that. We should instead see in it a kind of openness to something better. To me, that sort of openness, which is not a good sign about our society, it's a bad sign. It's a response to failures, is nonetheless a reason to be hopeful that change is possible. And it should lead us to ask ourselves what we can do wherever we are. And that can look like intellectual work. It can look like spiritual work. It can look like community building. It can look like voluntary work or teaching or just being a better professional wherever you find yourself or building a stronger family. But all these things, I think, have to speak to some sense that if we do this right, we can allow other people to see a better way forward. And there's not enough of that sense in our society now. So I am hopeful. I am hopeful because America has shown itself to be capable of extraordinary resurgence and resilience. We cite Tocqueville as a warning about what can go wrong, but Tocqueville offered that warning in the 1830s. And he didn't say this is going to go wrong in 100 years. He saw it going wrong around him. And the society that he saw did respond in some meaningful ways. It also went through very, very hard times. And it's gone through several cycles of those kinds of hard times and response since then. I think part of what we can learn from that is that it is possible to respond to these kinds of problems, to build on what we have. It's not going to be a permanent solution, a durable solution. It's not going to be clean or fun or simple, but it can be done. And ultimately, it is our job to think about how and to see to it that we're doing all we can to make it possible. So that's what my hopefulness looks like. It doesn't look like a sense of confidence exactly. It looks like a search for opportunities and openness to doing this better.
Ross, in your last book, you talk about a possibility of a sustainable stagnation. Do you want to counter this more hopeful message of Yuval's? Can we sort of muddle along with this sort of unfolding disaster, or have we really reached an inflection point in these last couple of weeks, these last couple of years, where we really do need a kind of fundamental change if if we're to pull ourselves out of the spiral?
I mean, I was so dark in my opening remarks that I feel like I should, like Yuval, try and offer some optimism. I think that the one sort of semi-optimistic account is that having this kind of year of living dangerously, if you will, that sort of exposes the, derangement and unhappiness lurking below the sort of gloss of sustainable decadence, is itself a potential spur to action and reform along the lines that Yuval is suggesting, right? That, a society can sort of be on a kind of glide path to an Aldous Huxley endgame and never really notice sort of inch by inch how it's going along. And so in that sense, to be providentialist about it, as Christians told by Jews to be better Christians should be, right? You could say that, God sends wake-up calls and, sends messages to society, sometimes in the form of, terrible plagues, to say, here's an opportunity to see the deeper problems in your society and how they might manifest themselves under conditions of stress and strain and crisis, and also to have an opportunity to, maybe once some kind of normalcy is restored, to try and make things better and put things right. So that's one sort of at least semi-optimistic account. And I also agree with Yuval that, historically, the US and like most societies has moved in these cycles, right? And people don't just sort of stay in fragmentation forever. Human beings are, driven by a desire for family and community and spiritual meaning and all these things. And so you go through periods of dislocation and general unhappiness, and then you get into eras of good feelings, right? And then the cycle begins again. And you don't have to be like a Peter Turchin, who I mentioned before, who tries to nail this as an exact science and say you measure it in these 24-year increments, and you can see these spikes and valleys. You don't have to buy into that exact kind of psychohistory to see that there is that general pattern. And one of my anxieties about the US or about the West generally is that you can sort of slide out of that kind of pattern and into something where you're just on this sort of glide path to nowhere. And so, yeah, in a way, getting back into a cycle of large scale discontent leading to tumult and conflict, leading to kind of rebuilding of institutions could be a good sign. I do think, though, that you have to think, we have to think seriously about how you integrate and subdue in certain ways the power of the information technology that we've unleashed. And I think there are a lot of sort of superficial ideas about how you do that, where like, if only you have the right Facebook moderating or, maybe the right antitrust policy or something, you can bring some of these forces to heel. But we really have clearly, entered into a period where human social life is now just mediated by a technology that did not exist 20 or 25 years ago. And there has to be some kind of substantial adaptation to that. And I tend to think that substantial adaptation has to involve sort of not abandoning the technology, but sort of putting it in its place in a profound way, in ways that I think, to Yuval's point, have to sort of probably start with the local level in certain ways, with churches and schools and families figuring out how to subdue technology before or maybe at the same time as you change policy towards Silicon Valley. But that seems to me to be a really important challenge for any kind of progress in the cycles that Yuval is describing.
I think that's not only true, it also points to a broader problem with thinking cyclically the way that we've suggested here, which is the cycles don't just happen. They require action and reaction that have to be purposeful, that have to be engaged in by people who see them as problems to be addressed. And there's a tendency now to be passive observers of what's happening, even at the highest reaches of our key institutions, where there's a lot of dissatisfaction with various things that could be addressed. To take a very prosaic example, if you talk to any member of Congress, as for my sins, I do this a lot, you would find that they are all dissatisfied with how Congress works. And it's occurred to almost none of them that they could just change it however they want, pretty simply. And the idea that, well, this is what we're stuck with, and my job is to just complain about how bad it is very pervasive. And I think it speaks to the situation we're in with the internet, because there is this kind of reflexive response to ideas about trying to constrain its reach or to deflect it or to contain its influence that just say, well, this is just the infrastructure of communication now. It's not something for us to control or command. And in the process, we're undergoing an unbelievably dangerous experiment with the mediation of social life, with pornography, with all kinds of things that we should just do something about, obviously. And it's very, very hard to get people to see that doing something about this is just naturally what our society is for. And instead, we all fall into this view that we're just kind of watching it happen. And boy, I sure hope it goes okay. But there's a role for all of us in thinking about how it should go and what we might do about it. Some of that is political, it really is, and there needs to be much more openness, I think, to treating this as a subject for political work and for regulation too. And some of it is also at the kind of personal level where the passivity before the power of the technology has just gone too far, and it's part of a larger passivity that, you know, is one reason to be skeptical of any hopeful narrative, right? If we believe that things getting bad enough to drive change is how things get better, the change has to be driven. We have to say, well, I got to do something about it. And if we're too reticent to do that in any arena of our life, then there's less reason for hope.
So on the more, I guess, hopeful side of the ledger, if we can move in that direction, which I think you both have, if we were to hold this conference in 15, 20 years, and we would speak about that moment of crisis in 2020 and 2021 that America went through and successfully navigated, and happily we saw a revitalization of institutions, of social institutions, of a sense of responsibility in people's roles in those institutions, a reduction of the sense of performativity that you've all mentioned. Where do you think we would be most likely to see such a revival or such a renaissance? And when I look at the landscape, when I think about the landscape of our institutions today, either on a partisan basis, they're mistrusted. The universities today have very low levels of trust among conservatives. Obviously, police, law enforcement has very low levels of trust on the political left. I mean, we saw patriots attacking Congress the other day. Who would have ever thought that we'd have, the patriotic party attacking the nation's capital? The churches, obviously, we've already mentioned how, especially the mainline and Catholic institutions are suffering a real deficit of trust today. And I think we all have some hope pinned on the possibility of reviving the family. But the family is under extraordinary duress today. Among other things, fewer and fewer people forming families. In a sense, you can only revive or give health to an institution. In some ways, it's kind of it's a chicken and egg problem. When you've been well formed by an institution, then you know how to participate in that formation. So if we're to see a kind of revival, is there a sector, is there an area, is there a particular institution where you would think, looking back, maybe in the rear view from a better future, we can say that's where it began? I'm curious whether you have any thoughts or hopes about where that might begin.
Well, if you're starting with me, I would say, and maybe I should be careful saying this at Notre Dame, but I think that this kind of change in the American story only happens through a transformation in American Protestantism. I don't think there's really any other way for social change of this scale to happen in American society, except by, in some very meaningful way, some form of religious revival among American Protestants. And I think that there is always an opportunity for that, because American Protestantism is very diverse and very lively and dynamic. It's obviously in trouble now, as so many institutions are, but nonetheless has a lot of energy. I think that people who have given up too soon on America are often people who don't see that potential in American Protestantism. Actually, I think Tocqueville is one of them. Tocqueville, for all that he saw so much about America, just couldn't take Protestants seriously, and therefore didn't see anti-slavery, didn't see the kind of revitalization of American society that happened in the generations after he wrote, which was really a function of a set of events and transformations that it seems to me were not within his capacity to imagine. This is good news and bad news, but I think that if it's going to happen on the level of a real social transformation, obviously we can say it has to start in the family, and that's true. It has to start at the local community, and that's true. But I think it has to involve in some significant way the rise of a powerful strain of American Protestantism that speaks into the moment and speaks into the culture and transforms the hunger that now is deforming our society into something that reforms our society. Only religion can do that. And in our country, I think it's probably the case that only Protestant Christianity can do that.
Ross, any
If I was there in person.
The betrayal, Yuval, in Notre Dame with me and Patrick. No, I think that's very, very plausible. I would go further and be a little more specific and say that it would not surprise me if that form of Protestantism was defined by recent immigrants in some way, either either Latino Protestants, who are an increasingly important part of the Latino population, again, to the great discredit of our own Catholic Church, to which they or many of their ancestors belonged, and also Asian Americans, who are a sort of very interesting player in American national life, whose full influence or potential influence, I think, has not yet been felt. But within, especially East Asian Americans, there is a fairly robust forms of Protestantism inherited from the heyday of the Protestant missions that may yet have an unexpected role to play in American life. To that point, I'd add a couple other scenarios. One is that, and this may be more on a 100-year time horizon than a 20-year time horizon, but in that theme of cycles, if you enter a period of low birth rates and family collapse, there is presumably some kind of selection pressure, to sound like a bit like a Darwinian, right, that gets placed on the institutions that endure and continue, right? So we're definitely in a period where it's hard for men and women to pair off successfully. It seems hard for people to form and raise families together, and it's not clear what the sort of mass market model of family formation and sort of male-female burden sharing is supposed to be. But it may be that gets figured out through sort of selection, where the successful family models are the ones that form stable families, that let people have not just one kid, but 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 kids. And those kids formed in those families go on to form more stable families of their own. And over a multi-generational cycle, you get sort of people who are formed by the family models that work for the second half of the 21st century. And we sort of experiment our way towards them in the first half. With Amy Coney Barrett and her husband as the models for the fecund future of 2062. There's some shameless Notre Dame pandering to cut against Yuval's shilling for the Protestants. Then the other thing that that's more unlikely, but I do think about is, I sometimes wonder if there could be a serious religious revival within the meritocracy that is a revival of some form of traditional religion, not the kind of mix of post-Christian spirituality and post-Protestant political stuff that you have right now. I think there are a lot of people in academia and in elite society who look at sort of wokeness and sort of everything around it and don't like it and want to resist it and are looking for sort of resources and alternatives to resist it. And I think sort of the liberal meritocracy has this it sort of lived with this deep incoherency in its worldview for a long time, where it has sort of a, residually Christian ethic of equality and justice combined with a sort of, naturalistic, materialist, atheist cosmology, which don't really fit together, and everyone sort of knows they don't really fit together, but nobody wants to sort of take the plunge into something that does fit together. But I just wonder if maybe that changes at some point, and maybe some version of today's liberal humanists who don't want to go all the way with social justice, or don't want to go all the way with the left, find themselves looking anew at some form of traditional religion. That is not happening right now on any large scale, but it is a hypothetical that sort of lurks in the back of my mind. And, is one thing I use to justify my continued shilling for traditional religion in the pages of the Meritocracy's leading broadsheet.
Well,
If I can piggyback on that real quick, I think that makes a lot of sense, and also that the centrality of the meritocracy to the problems we're talking about can't be overstated. That there is something painful about living in a society that seems to distribute privilege and wealth and honor in ways that you don't find legitimate. And a lot of social crisis and breakdown in democratic societies ultimately is about that kind of pain. And I think that is at the heart of both what is driving some of today's populism, just a sense that who the hell are these people? And also that at the same time that the populists think the meritocracy is this strong, overpowering force that is controlling their lives, the meritocracy is actually at the same time going through a tremendous crisis of confidence and is actually very weak. And although it is not open to the criticism made of it by populists, it is doubtful of itself and of its own credibility and its own legitimacy. And that's a combination that could be quite explosive in bad ways and in good ways. And it seems to me that that's really crucial to understanding all the different sides of the social crisis that we've been describing here from various angles. At the core of it is just the question of kind of who gets to be at the top in the culture, in the academy, in politics, in the professional world. And that the way we now answer that question is in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, I've just finished reading and reviewing Michael Sandel's new book on the tyranny of merit. I'm sure you're familiar with, if not the book, some of his arguments. One of the things that I found unsaid, I thought his critique of the pathologies of meritocracy was really powerful and really clear and condemning. But I find myself unsatisfied with his proposals at the end of that book, one of which seemingly was sort of more democratic, which he proposes a kind of lottery of the qualified. So once you were deemed qualified according to Harvard standards, then there would be a lottery who would gain entry. So maybe diminishing the sense that I had made it on my own. I'm dubious that it would have that kind of effect. It seems to me that if the universities, and I think without universities having some role in strengthening of institutions, there's really I think that builds on Yuval's last point. I agree. I think that the churches, the family, obviously, but unless the leadership class in some ways takes on this sense of having a role within these social institutions, and that has to be modeled within the schools and the universities, it's going to be a very tough road. So I'm wondering whether you have. I mean, I know Ross obviously has written a book on the meritocracy. He's thought about this a lot. But whether you have your own sort of proposals for what you think might begin to reform the shortcomings and the pathologies of the current leadership class.
That's got to be yours,
Ross. Why don't you take a shot at that, if you're willing?
Yeah, I mean, I actually did an event, a Zoom event for Yuval's program at AEI with Sandel. That was, I highly recommended. It's obviously brilliant. You can find it, I'm sure, on YouTube. And I too was very dissatisfied with the lottery proposal, and sort of we argued a bit about that. I mean, I don't know. When I wrote my own book about Harvard many years ago, when I was like 12 years old, I had, I think, a sort of pretty conventional view that the problem with the meritocracy was that it had recreated the very privileges that it had supposedly overthrown, and created this sort of new upper class that was, very smart and talented, but also just sort of reproducing its own privileges. And so the thing to do was to open the doors wider, have more class-based affirmative action, have more sort of, geographic recruitment, try and get, more smart kids from all over into places like Harvard. So it wasn't just this sort of, the liberal version of the Northeastern prep school sort of assembly line. Now I think the problem, I don't think you want to put talented people into the meritocracy exactly. I think actually that's probably bad. And you want to basically figure out how to decentralize the kind of power that the meritocracy wields, and figure out how to create more potent regional and local elites, as opposed to having this sort of unified national elite. It would be much better for the country if we had a Midwestern elite that was really different from the Northeastern elite, that was different from the Floridian elite. And, we do to some extent, right? It's not entirely uniform, but meritocracy really has created a kind of homogeneity in this sort of national ruling class that was not the reality in like late 19th century America. But how you accomplish that is a really tough problem. I think I wrote a column once called like "Break Up the Liberal City," where some of my proposals included basically trying to treat the elite colleges like a kind of cartel, tax their endowments, do various things to try and weaken their institutional power. I mean, one of the striking things is, about American life in the last 50 years is, with a few exceptions, how little turnover there is, right? And in the top of the US News and World Report rankings. I mean, University of Chicago sort of clawed its way up, for better or worse. And, but, basically this just seems like a sort of, there isn't one monopoly, but it's a sort of monopolistic landscape. But maybe the answer is you want, maybe this is a place where the federal government, in the way that like land grant universities transformed education in the 19th century, maybe you want the federal government to create national universities that are sort of, in certain ways more politicized, with Democrats and Republicans in Congress fighting over tenure appointments. How's that for a terrifying thought? But yeah, I feel like
So you're saying things could be worse.
I'm saying things could be worse. Yeah. Anyway.
I agree with that, but I think that there is I think there are two ways to think about what's wrong with meritocracy. You could say that it lets the wrong people in, and you could say that it puts far too few restraints on what those people can then do in American life. And I actually think the bigger problem is the second problem. The reason people resent the meritocracy is not that they wish their own kids could go to Princeton. I don't think that's really the dream of a large segment of Americans. I think the reason that they resent the meritocracy is that it seems like people who go to these schools then go on to run everything, and they're not answerable to anybody for anything. And that one path to addressing that problem can look more like imposing some institutional restraints on the people who run various institutions in American life. That being a lawyer would mean you have a particular job, not that you are an all-purpose activist. That being in public health means you have a particular job, not that you're an all-purpose activist. Holding people to certain responsibilities and obligations in ways that mean that the privilege they have, the power they have, comes with constraints. I think it's certainly right to say that we now have this bizarre kind of uniform elite, which is not the traditional American way. And I think it's not just regional, but it's kind of sectoral. The people who used to run American corporations just weren't very much like the people who ran American universities or who ran Hollywood or the publishing industry. These were different elites, distinctly different. They had different characters, they had different religions, they had different backgrounds, different assumptions, different politics. Now they all went to the same schools at the same time. They know each other. They're interchangeable. And there is really this one elite that runs all the different institutions. I think there are ways, by some recovery of institutional character and integrity and responsibility, to push back against that a little. But I certainly do agree, Patrick, that there would also have to be change within the university. And I hate to despair, but looking at the universities, I'm not sure where that comes from and how it works.
Why don't we turn time remaining to a few questions? I'm looking at a couple that are similar. My colleague, a retired colleague, Walter Nagorski at the Program of Liberal Studies, asks, well, what national policies will help us work reform from the bottom up? Another person asks, I was wondering to what extent this crisis of institutions should be understood as a structural problem requiring a structural solution. Is it possible that a top-down response might be the way forward? And if so, then is it possible to state under what circumstances a conservative progressive common good alliance against both identity politics and corporate overreach might become a live option? So a few people are interested in whether there are, I think, public or governmental public solutions to the problem that we're talking about. Can the public sphere do something to help restore or revive or revitalize the sort of social institutions? I mean, Yuval, I think you play both sides of this a little bit in the sense that the public realm can crowd out the kind of civic associations and institutions that are so vital. But on the other hand, maybe there are certain kinds of policies that might assist in their restoration or strengthening.
Yeah, I think playing both sides of this is the American way. The logic of the Constitution is to take these seemingly contradictory options and say, yes, that's right. These two things need to exist together. And in the tension between them is where we create the space in which a free society really lives its life. And I think that's certainly true here. I would say that to begin with, if you think about national policy, you have to start with the principle of physician heal thyself. And there's a lot of work to be done in our actual national governing institutions to help them function better. And that looks like especially congressional reform. I mean, I think we're in a moment now that's a little bit analogous to the moment in the 1970s when what we now call originalism was born, where there was a sense that you needed to start from scratch in thinking about the role of the judge in that case, and build both an intellectual framework to answer the question, what is the role, and then build an institutional framework to help that matter. But I think we're in a moment like that now when it comes to Congress, where the next phase of conservative constitutionalism has to start from an entire rebuilding of the idea of what Congress is for, which is fundamentally to enable accommodation and allow competing and divergent groups to reach compromises. That's the purpose of the institution. And in its absence, that doesn't happen anywhere else. And we see what that looks like. I think the future of our republic really depends on a recovery of Congress's understanding of itself and its capacity to live up to that understanding. And there is real work to be done on that front. And the kind of resurgence more generally that we're talking about here would be helped enormously if that were possible. I think it would take time, but it is the kind of thing that could be possible. Beyond that, there's also room for a greater tolerance and for an encouragement of federalism or subsidiarity, the notion that we solve our problems from the bottom up in a variety of ways. That does mean enabling civil society institutions to play a role in the implementation of public policy. It also means enabling those institutions to do what they do in the way that they see best. But it also means putting up with a lot of nonsense. And I think we've found that pretty hard on the right. That means, in other words, it means putting up with things happening in public libraries in California that you would never want to happen in your community. And that's just what it is. It means that the left gets to be the left where it can, and the right gets to be the right where it can. And most of the country lives under some combination of those two things. That's basically a set of experiments that tries to find a way to enable people to live in a community that they can take to be legitimate and worthwhile, and that they see as enabling them to raise their family. There are ways that government can be more supportive of that than it has been, but ultimately that's just a supporting role. That's not the leading role, and I think that's the right way to think about it.
I mean, I would, while agreeing with much of that, I'm not quite as sort of, I don't know. I feel like we've run a lot of experiments with letting the right be the right and letting the left be the left in America over the last 40 or 50 years. And what that tends to mean is that sort of expressive individualism in its right-wing and left-wing forms gets a certain kind of free rein and runs a bit roughshod over community in both in both sort of right-leaning spaces and left-leaning spaces. So I guess I'm still, I still think that you need some kind of left-right, not fusion exactly, but from the left, you can take the idea, which happily, I think Joe Biden does seem to be taking, that you can put a somewhat firmer economic foundation underneath the American family, whether through child tax credits or wage subsidies, the earned income tax credit, and so on, which, doesn't do enough, but it does something. And then from the right, and I don't think we're getting that at the moment, but you need a certain kind of, resistance to social liberalism's war on traditional institutions and traditional restraints, right? I think it's, a bad thing that hopefully the current Supreme Court will push back against, that you have in blue and bluish states, this sort of constant conflict between the liberal bureaucracy and traditional religious institutions, whether it's, evangelical florists, not a traditional religious institution, but you take my point, or Catholic adoption agencies. I think it's a bad thing, which nobody seems to be resisting, that we're sort of marching towards various forms of drug legalization in the US. So I guess I'm not ready to sort of just be a federalist. I think, sort of national level economic policy that's more a sort of pro-family, but also sort of on the left in some ways. And yeah, I mean, you have to have some kind of social conservatism that resists left individualism.
Yeah, I think that sort of combination of the spirit of reform and the conservative disposition into some kind of reforming conservatism, ought to be the way we think about national politics. I think that's absolutely right. Its attitude toward social policy, though, should also, I think, make a lot of room for local experimentation that isn't just a form of kind of pilot programs where the experiment is in order to find out what could work at the national level, but should be willing to live with the fact that there will just be differences in the ways that different communities, not just individuals, ultimately want to live.
So as we would rightly expect, there's a large number of questions which we're not going to be able to get through. But let me take one question, the last question that I'll pose to you, as on the other end of the scale, which is thinking not so much on the macro scale, but more on the micro scale. So Joseph Graziano, who is a law student and Soren Fellow in the Nicola Center, states that he finds this discussion incredibly helpful in terms of diagnosing the problem and expressing a potential solution, but wants to know whether you would have any thoughts on how we might go about encouraging our peers, the people that we live with, so in the institutions that we might happen to be in, universities, where we work and so forth, our neighborhoods, those in particular who might not be so inclined as we are to take the steps necessary to build or rebuild the flagging integrity of our social institutions. How can we work not only to be persons of integrity ourselves, but also encourage integrity in others to break down the toxic communities that are tearing apart our social institutions? And Dan Lipinski, who I believe is a congressman, maybe soon former congressman, asks this similar question: how do we get out of this tribal society? But in particular, how do we do so on the kind of maybe much more interpersonal scale? Do you have any thoughts, ways we might think about that as a set of parting reflections?
Well, I guess I'll start. I think it's a wonderful set of questions. And my view is that kind of process begins by trusting each other's motives a little more than we might naturally be inclined to do, by beginning from the premise that the people we disagree with are not trying to destroy the country, but have a different view of how it might be improved, and trying to help them see on their own terms how what we have in mind would be a way forward. And honestly, I think there may be no better example of how to do that in our public life than the way that Ross approaches his readership in the New York Times, which is not, it's not easy, I would imagine. But it begins by taking seriously the notion that these people who come to very different views about what would be best begin from very similar desires to improve our society. and to look out for people in need and to live in a more just community, and ultimately to have this be a better world. I do think we begin from that common premise. And very often the way we practice politics and the way we approach politics, at least implicitly, feels like we begin from the premise that we're good and they're bad, and that's why beating them is the most important thing. It would be better to begin from the premise that there are huge problems here, and we may disagree about how to address them, but that's what we're disagreeing about. It's not easy to do. I mean, I certainly do my best to learn from people like Ross and others just how to do that, because it takes enormous work. I think it takes very great care in thinking about who your audience is without letting that deform what your argument is and what your view of the truth is. But I think it's worth doing, because ultimately we do live in a society that is and will remain a society that houses great differences. And we have to speak across these lines and try to find converts and try to find accommodations and try to find compromises. That's what good citizenship looks like. And hard as it is, it's worth the work.
I have a 1 hour long response to that question, but in fact, I have to jump off in 30 seconds because I have a family obligation. So I will say one sentence, which is try to live as much of your everyday life in your neighborhood and your social relationships as if the internet and its arguments do not exist at all. And I sort of live in fear of the day when my own everyday life will be sort of conquered by the existence that I have on the internet, but it hasn't happened yet. It may never happen, and it is something to be sort of manfully resisted.
Thanks. I think both those last comments are really hope-giving to renew that sense of hope that I think Yuval was rightly talking about. Thank you both for spending this time with us and with all the people who are viewing here today. Thanks to Carter and the Center for sponsoring this event, for bringing us together. I want to thank the Center and to mention that this evening's closing event will take place at 8 o'clock tonight with California Poet Laureate Dana Gioia. You can use the same link, the Zoom link that you used for this session to log into that session. More information is on the Nicola Center website. Thank you again to Yuval and Ross, and I know there would be absolutely standing ovation applause for your comments and for your reflections today, but in lieu of that, I just please accept my thanks and gratitude on behalf of everyone who was listening here today. Good to see you both.
Thanks very much.
Good to see you, Patrick. Thank you.